So far in the last few lessons, we've been looking at the agricultural changes that takes place in communist China between 1949 and 1965. We focused on the creation of these people's communes and the establishment of the policy of collectivization over this period and the consequences that this had in terms of the famine that was established. Well, in this lesson, what we're going to do is start to talk about the other side of economic policy during this period, which of course relates to industrial changes. Now, there is a close tie and relationship between industrial changes and agricultural changes, specifically when we talk about the impact of industrial policy on agriculture, specifically related to the Great Leap Forward, which is the second 5-year plan. But this lesson, we're going to focus on the first of these 5-year plans. The first being the one that is arguably the most successful of the two, and the most successful initially, at least. So the first of the 5-year plans that we see within Mao's China takes place between the years 1952 and 1956. And this lesson is going to examine the successes and failures of this first 5-year plan, and also examine the influences of the USSR and the targets of that plan that was set and the results of that plan, and just generally speaking, doing a more holistic assessment of the successes and failures of this first 5-year plan. Now, we can't talk about the 5-year plans, we can't talk about specifically the first 5-year plan without reference to the USSR, to the Soviet Union. It's because the Soviet Union was highly influential, both directly in the creation of this first 5-year plan, but also indirectly in the fact that it was influenced by the USSR that Mao really came up with these ideas relating to agricultural and industrial policy in general. Don't forget, when we looked at collectivization, Mao was very reticent of the fact that the USSR was a state that tried out collectivization and ultimately failed to an extent with the famine in the 1920s. But so therefore was somebody who believed that collectivization had to have taken place on a much longer basis, on a much more broad time span. But there are also reasons why the Soviet Union was important for the creation of the first 5-year plan. One of these reasons was essentially because the first 5-year plan was modeled on Stalin's first 5 years plan that was actually successful in the Soviet Union. So the 5-year plans that Stalin had implemented were relatively successful. Of course, there was a lacking when it came to the amount of consumer surplus, the amount of consumer goods produced, but when it came to just the general industrial output of the Soviet Union during the first 5-year plans, this was something that was generally quite successful. The USSR at the time was also a major ally, and we have the fact that the rest of the world, the rest of the West essentially, had put a grain embargo on China as a result of their involvement in the Korean War. So relations were tense between China and the Western states because of China's intervention within the Korean War that we looked at in a previous lesson. So therefore, the USSR was a major ally, and one of the major allies that they could rely on during this particular period. And then finally, we have the fact that there were ideological reasons for supporting the USSR and the USSR supporting Communist China. They were both communist states. And don't forget, we are talking about the development of communism in China during the Cold War. So there was definitely a lot more of a camaraderie between these states at the time because of the fact that that we have this growing divide between East and West, this growing divide between communism and capitalism during this period. And so with the influence of the USSR and with the fact that the USSR will have a generally positive impact when it comes to when it comes to industrial policy at the time, we see the creation of the Sino-Soviet Mutual Assistance Treaty. Now, this was an agreement between the USSR and the People's Republic of China that was made in February 1950. And as part of the Sino-Soviet Mutual Assistance Treaty, each party would do the following. They would, quote, render the other all possible economic assistance and carry out necessary cooperation. So quite a broad mandate that is established here by this treaty, but essentially it is a mutual assistance, economic mutual assistance treaty that is established between the two states. And the result of which would be the USSR providing support for China in terms of substantial economic injection, essentially, of finances, around $300 million over the 5 years in equivalence in terms of the US currency. Now, they would also provide the USSR with a number of industrial provisions, including iron constructions, steel plants, and machinery plants, and the USSR will also do the same for China. There was this mutual assistance that takes place on both sides of the treaty itself. It wasn't just the USSR providing assistance to China, but China was also under the assumption that they would provide economic assistance to the USSR, given any kind of situation where that may take place. But of course, at this point in February 1950, China was substantially less prosperous than the USSR at this point, because the USSR had gone through a period of industrialization in the 20s and 30s, had gone through the Second World War that they called the Great Patriotic War, and have come out of the Second World War as one of, if not the second largest superpower in the world. So China had a lot of catching up to do in that particular regard, considering they have gone from a relatively agrarian society. They had the invasion of Japan, invasion by Japan, should I say, and then also the Chinese Civil War itself, and then also the impact of the Korean War. So let's examine the first 5-year plan in more detail. Mao wanted to see the first 5-year plan increase the industrial capacity, specifically relating to China's heavy industries. And so when we talk about heavy industries, we talk about things like coal and steel, and we talk about electricity output as well. That's also something that we're going to examine in this lesson too. And the main underlying motivation for this was to support the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, with the production of military supplies. There was this growing consensus that there needed to be a strong military force in the form of the CCP's military wing, essentially, which is what the PLA was. And so, therefore, there was this strong idea that we need to see heavy industry develop and increase in its capacity to be able to support these military needs. So the question you have to ask is, was the plan successful? And if we were to take just a yes or no answer to that question, the answer would probably be yes, to a greater extent, because most of the targets that were set by the CCP were actually either met or they were dramatically exceeded. We'll talk about that in a second. But there were a great number of huge infrastructure developments as well that takes place. We see at least from a propaganda perspective, when you see huge infrastructure developments take place, it sort of shows the industrial might and the industrial capabilities of the country, which is of course something that is relatively successful. So, for example, one example of this is the building of the bridge across the Yangtze River, which was very successful in terms of industrial success, in terms of infrastructure and architectural success. But it was also an incredible propaganda piece that they could use they could roll out whenever they wanted to show the industrial might of the CCP. So when we talk about the growth in industry, we have to also see how this affects the population, because how does this sort of trickle down, if you will, to the general populace? Well, we see an increase of people moving into and reproducing within the towns and cities of around 100 million people over this period. So over 100 million people be in the towns and cities, will grow in the towns and cities as a result of these quite extravagant economic and industrial policies that are implemented. And in terms of the output themselves, we have some statistics that you can refer to, essentially over 100% productions leading to related to the plan. So, for example, the target that was set for electrical power was exceeded by 121.6%. So they had met the target that they had set by 100%, and then they went 21.6% over that in terms of exceeding that target. When it came to steel production, a similar thing, 129.8%. And then when it came to coal production, we have an increase of 115%. So you can see really very successful in terms of exceeding the amount of targets that were set. With that being said, we have to do a holistic analysis, we have to do a historical analysis of this, and so therefore we have to think about what the failures of the plan were. What were the things that were not particularly that successful related to the plan? Well, broadly speaking, it should be noted that the plan was overall pretty successful. It was generally quite successful, but there were some notable criticisms that can be levied at it. So, for example, while there was an overproduction in industrial materials compared to the plan's targets, there were questions and critiques relating to the quality of said material in certain regards. So, to some extent, even though there was an overproduction, it's not necessarily the case that the quality of those materials were up to standards or up to par in any kind of way, and so therefore they were essentially reducing the quality of those production in response to trying to get the quantity out. So we have an increase in quantity, which is obviously good, but maybe that lacks the quality. There was also a lack of administration in the coordination of the plan. This would be something that would plague the CCP for quite a while in terms of the ability to coordinate people and to coordinate resources in the creation of industrial output for these different plans. We'll see when we look at the Great Leap Forward in the next lesson that there are significant failings that start to exist, that start to seep in terms of the cracks that we start to see during the industrial process of China. And we also have the problem of long-term economic growth, because long-term economic growth would be something that would require an increase in literacy levels for those who are working in industry. And so the fact that there was a lack of education, there was a lack of literacy, and there was a lack of the general ability for a lot of workers to be competent in the creation of these in these productions means that we see long-term economic growth be hampered. And we see this again. All of these are sort of cracks that start to show when we talk about the first 5-year plan. When we look at the Great Leap Forward, these become significant problems during this period.